The Madwoman Tao Hong died in the peach orchard, her body covered with fallen blossoms when she was found. Lying next to her was my fifth aunt, Guiying. In those days, wandering women had no human rights, like rotten vegetable leaves discarded in the market, greedily picked up by bachelors. Tao Hong was one such woman, picked up by Old Hai. I was 8 that year, sitting with the adults around a fire in the main room, their chatting making me drowsy. Suddenly, my cousin burst in, the wind and snow rushing in with him. Before my aunt could scold him, he shouted, "Come see." Old Hai brought a woman back. The murmurs instantly turned into a commotion. The women stood up and swarmed outside, and I was swept along, standing under the eaves of the door. Old Hai lived at the southern end of the village, and my house was on his way home. Soon, a gray figure emerged from the path, smiling. It was Old Hai. Old Hai wore only a single layer of clothing, his frostbitten face using pus, but it couldn't hide his energetic spirit. My aunt teased him, "Hey, Old Hai's gonna enjoy life now." My other aunt added, "Tell your woman to keep it down. My son needs to study in the morning. If she wakes him up at night, see if I don't slap you." Old Hai didn't get angry. He turned his head and leaned closer, slap away. Slap a few more times. I bet it'll wake him up 7 or 8 times. She spat sunflower seeds at his feet, and the women laughed. Not understanding, I hid behind my mother, peeking at the woman on Old Hai's back. Old Hai had cleaned her up. She looked pretty, not like a wanderer. But when she smiled along with the others, her foolishness was clear. Old Hai stopped joking and hurried home with the madwoman on his back. Everyone wore knowing smiles, except for my fifth aunt beside me, who stared expressionlessly at the madwoman until she disappeared. Then she quietly left in the wind and snow unnoticed. Everyone went back inside, shaking off the snow. The madwoman's arrival gave them half an hour of gossip, during which they exchanged information and pieced together her past 20 years. They couldn't remember her name but knew she was 20, with a younger brother. 2 years ago, she failed her college entrance exam, drank poison at home, and was saved, but went mad. At first, her parents locked her in the house. Later, she became uncontrollable, so they took her brother and moved away, leaving her to fend for herself. Sigh, such a pretty girl, what a pity. Someone sighed, and everyone echoed the sentiment. My mother handed me my winter homework and scolded, "Go study." Look at her, she felt so bad for failing that she drank poison. "Your scores are so low, it's embarrassing." I obediently took my homework to the inner room, but felt upset, thinking my mother cared more about my grades than me. During the new year, I didn't want to study. Bored, I lay on the table, carving an eraser with a knife. Suddenly, I heard branches breaking and hurried footsteps outside. I quickly climbed onto the bed and lifted the curtain, catching a glimpse of Old Hai's back. 10 minutes later, Old Hai returned with my fifth uncle following him. Fifth uncle was a gambler, hadn't been home for half a month, and now he was back before dark. Something must have happened. I put on my hat and scarf, sneaking out of the house, wrapping the scarf as I ran. "Go die at your mother's place if you want to die." Before I reached my uncle's house, I heard him shouting. He was surely yelling at my aunt. He always beat her. I stopped at his door, seeing him carry her into the yard, blood staining the snow. I froze. The blood trail led into the yard, ending at the closed door. Panting heavily, my ears covered by the hat, I could only hear my own breath. Opposite my uncle's house was Old Hai's. My aunt's blood seemed to celebrate Old Hai and the madwoman's wedding. I opened the door and went in. My uncle was wrapping my aunt's wrist with an old shirt. Seeing me, he didn't chase me away but dragged me to the bed. "Watch her, don't let her die." Then he searched her, found 50 yuan and left. I stood by the bed, watching. My aunt's once fair skin was now pale from blood loss, her lips almost blending with her skin. She woke up, tears falling before she opened her eyes. She turned away, muttering, "How am I worse than a madwoman? Even she has someone, but I don't. I'm worse than a madwoman." It got dark, and my uncle didn't return. He didn't care about the woman who slit her wrists for him. Hearing my mother call me for dinner, I left my aunt and went home. The blood in front of her door was already covered by new snow. Old Hai's house opposite was lit, the madwoman's cat-like screams piercing through. The madwoman originally had no name. She always wore a peach-red long gown, regardless of the season. It was an opera costume she had picked up from somewhere, so everyone simply called her Tao Hong. Old Hai kept Tao Hong chained at home until the next summer, when the chain was removed and she was finally settled in the village. She behaved like a dog trained by Old Hai, knowing to run back to his house when hungry, tired, or when it rained. Old Hai treated her well, never letting her lack food. Whenever he attended a banquet, he would bring back a box full of meat for Tao Hong to eat slowly. Originally as thin as a stick, Tao Hong became plump like a balloon by early autumn. I later overheard my mother and grandmother chatting and learned that Tao Hong was pregnant. Tao Hong had nothing to do and spent her days wandering the village with her big belly. But I noticed that whenever Tao Hong wandered outside, my fifth aunt was nowhere to be seen. This was a secret everyone knew but never talked about. Aunt Guiying deliberately avoided Tao Hong, maintaining a superficial peace. This continued until my fifth uncle, who drove long-haul trucks, returned home. When he left, Tao Hong was not pregnant. When he came back, her belly was already prominent. He parked his truck in front of his house and saw Tao Hong coming out of Old Hai's house. Tao Hong was wearing her peach-red gown, which clung to her belly in the autumn wind. Seeing Tao Hong's belly, my uncle froze for about 10 seconds. His expression went from surprise to envy, then to anger. He looked like a mad dog biting its own tail, veins bulging on his forehead as he circled the truck. Finally, he found a crowbar in the truck bed, kicked open his door, and rushed to his wife, Aunt Guiying, who had been keeping house for him. I was sitting in front of their house, eating a pomegranate. Seeing my uncle like this, I shrank my neck, both scared and curious about what he would do next. I couldn't understand the deep hatred between my uncle and aunt. The first to suffer was Aunt Guiying's pot of spider plants. My uncle's iron bar mercilessly smashed the pot, the fragile stems lying on the red brick floor, covered in dirt. God damn it. Can you give birth or not? If not, just die. My mother's scream came from the main room, where she was stitching shoes with Aunt Guiying. Old Wu, are you crazy? Destroying your own house. To avoid getting hurt, I climbed the pomegranate tree in the yard. Through the red pomegranates, I saw Aunt Guiying kneeling behind my mother, crying and slapping her own face with the shoe insole. The insole was embroidered with pomegranate flowers, a symbol of fertility. Don't hit me, please. Aunt Guiying curled up in a ball, hitting herself hard with the insole. Tears and snot were whipped off her face onto the ground. But my uncle wasn't satisfied. He pushed my mother aside and hit Aunt Guiying's elbow with the iron bar. Her screams intensified, her voice changing pitch as she lay on the ground, unable to lift her arm. The pomegranate flower insole lay on the ground, trampled by my uncle. Others can give birth, even fools can. Why can't you? Did you abort someone else's child? I didn't, I really didn't. Aunt Guiying, dragging her broken arm, crawled to my uncle's feet, begging him to believe in her fidelity. But my uncle's iron bar showed no mercy despite her pleas and explanations. The sound of iron striking flesh echoed in the yard, occasionally sharper when it hit bone. With each strike, my uncle asked, "Can you give birth?" Yes. Please, give me more time. I'll give you a big fat boy. 2. No, 5, 10. Aunt Guiying, her hair disheveled, cried out. Even though she answered every time, my uncle didn't stop until he was exhausted, until her voice grew faint, until her skin turned from red to bruised, until the yard was surrounded by the entire village. Only then did my uncle throw away the crowbar, sit in a wicker chair, and light a cigarette, stop crying and make dinner. After 5 years of no kids, others would have kicked you out long ago. Aunt Guiying lay on the ground, covered in a mix of blood and sweat. She placed her still movable left hand on her belly, tears streaming from her swollen eyes. Suddenly, she took a deep breath and let out a long scream, alternating her legs, pounding her left fist on her stomach. blaming herself, wallowing in self-pity. My uncle no longer looked at her. He took some money from the house, opened his arms wide like shooing chicks, and walked step by step toward the gate. The onlookers retreated step by step until they were all outside the yard. In the following days, my fifth uncle stayed at the gambling den, not returning once to see Aunt Guiying. It was my mother who borrowed a tricycle and took Aunt Guiying to the hospital for treatment. With her arm in a sling, making it difficult for her to cook, my mother tasked me with bringing food to Aunt Guiying every day. Each time I went, Aunt Guiying would be sitting under the pomegranate tree, holding a pomegranate with one hand, stuffing it into her mouth, chewing and swallowing it whole, skin and all. On the 10th day, as usual, I went to deliver food to Aunt Guiying. This time, she was not under the pomegranate tree. White gauze fluttered in the breeze, hanging from the tree. Aunt Guiying, Aunt Guiying. I ran around the yard, calling out, afraid that she had attempted to take her own life again. Suddenly, a heart-wrenching scream shattered the village's tranquility. I jumped in fright and turned around to see Tao Hong fleeing from her house, clutching her belly. Behind her was Aunt Guiying, who lunged at Tao Hong, and the two of them tumbled to the ground. Aunt Guiying, straddling Tao Hong, raised her plaster cast-covered right arm and brought it down on Tao Hong's head, the splattered blood staining the white cast. Tao Hong couldn't speak and could only hold her head and scream. Aunt Guiying blamed her suffering on this pitiable woman. It was unclear who alerted them, but both my fifth uncle and Lao Hai returned simultaneously, each pulling their woman away. Tao Hong, her head injured by Aunt Guiying, lay in Lao Hai's arms, groaning incessantly. My fifth uncle, red-eyed from gambling and sleep deprivation, with stubble like a porcupine, punched Aunt Guiying in the face without a word. Aunt Guiying's teeth were knocked out, and she spat out a mouthful of bloody foam, which sprayed onto Tao Hong's peach-red opera costume, blooming like peach blossoms. Fifth uncle vented his gambling losses on Aunt Guiying, stomping on her knees. "You slut. Now you're hitting people? Can't even have a child and still causing trouble." He hurled insults mixed with spittle at Aunt Guiying's face. Lao Hai, tenderly stroking Tao Hong's belly, repeatedly asked, "How's the baby? Does your belly hurt?" But Tao Hong, being both mad and mute, couldn't answer his questions. Enraged, Lao Hai laid Tao Hong on the ground and approached fifth uncle. "Damn it, you owe me. Liaowu, I'm telling you, even if you beat your wife to death today, you still owe me compensation." Spit. Compensation? For what? Hearing the word compensation, fifth uncle jumped up, stomped on Aunt Guiying's knees, and grabbed Lao Hai's shoulders to argue with him. Medical expenses. Mental anguish. Lao Hai shouted, his neck red with anger. Fifth uncle laughed. Mental anguish for a lunatic? And you two aren't even married. Why should I pay you? Holding the rice bowl, I stood at the door, watching the two men grapple while the two women lay on the ground writhing. Lao Hai kicked fifth uncle. "Tao Hong is kind. Your wife is the real lunatic." Men only praise their wives when defending their own dignity. Lao Hai and fifth uncle wrestled, kicking up half a foot of dust from the dirt road. My mother carried me back home, and I don't know how long they fought. All I knew was that Tao Hong's baby survived, and Aunt Guiying's leg was broken, confining her to bed. A bedridden person posed no threat to Tao Hong, who safely carried Lao Hai's child to term. Tao Hong gave birth on the 16th day of the first lunar month, as snow blanketed the ground like a thick quilt. Snow fell for 2 days, trapping Lao Hai at the construction site. No vehicles could travel the roads, leaving walking as the only option to get home. During these 2 days, Winter Aunt delivered food to Tao Hong. Winter Aunt lived behind Lao Hai's house, an unmarried woman in her 50s who kept to herself and rarely spoke to others. Winter Aunt was the one who noticed Tao Hong's signs of labor. Lao Hai's house was poor, and being lazy, he hadn't lit a fire inside. On the 16th day of the first lunar month, when Winter Aunt went to deliver food, the wooden door made of old bedboards was frozen shut from melting snow that had flowed into the door gap and refrozen overnight. The ice was thick, and Winter Aunt didn't intend to open the door. She moved the woodpile blocking the window and called inside, "Tao Hong, food's here." There was no response from the dark house, and a strong fishy smell wafted to Winter Ant's nose. I guessed right, her water broke. Winter Ant later recounted her experience to us, smoothing her chest as if still frightened. I shone the flashlight inside, and Tao Hong turned her head and waved at me, her hair covering her face, looking like a ghost. At this point, we all instinctively recoiled and then urged Winter Ant to continue. Seeing our high spirits, Winter Ant recounted the story with even more enthusiasm, gesturing with her hands. When I finally broke down the door, the amniotic fluid that had flowed to the edge of the bed had frozen into a thin layer of ice. The quilt was cold as iron, with no warmth of a living person. Tao Hong lay there with her eyes closed, motionless. When I touched her, she was colder than the snow outside, with frost on her eyebrows. I quickly lit a fire and covered her with my own quilt. Maybe it was my freshly stuffed cotton quilt that was warm and the fire burned hot. Gradually, she actually woke up. Listening to this, we were enthralled and somewhat in awe of Winter Ant, who seemingly brought a frozen person back to life. However, in hindsight, it was likely an exaggeration. Even assuming a person could be revived after being frozen, how could Tao Hong, supposedly frozen solid, wave at Winter Ant through the window? Despite this, after Winter Ant's tale of saving Tao Hong spread, everyone in the village would ask her, "Winter Ant, tell us again what you saw that day." Winter Ant happily retold the story, though she never again mentioned Tao Hong waving at her. Before this incident, few people spoke to Winter Ant due to her unmarried status. Yet, what kind of suffering that poor woman endured on that cold winter night, no one knew. The events that followed required no retelling from Winter Ant. We all saw them. Someone went to the convenience store to call Lao Hai. The person said Lao Hai repeated over the phone several times, "Don't touch her. Wait for me to get back." So, everyone stood outside Lao Hai's house, forming concentric circles like ripples in water. Everyone watched silently as the snow fell quietly, and the woman inside writhed in pain on the bed, her screams echoing like a pig about to be slaughtered for the new year. Pain contorted Tao Hong's face. Her hands, covered in chilblains and grime under her nails, clutched the quilt. These were the hands that once held a pen. Her hair, greasy and tangled, concealed a head once full of knowledge. The swollen belly beneath the quilt no longer resembled the youthful body once clad in a school uniform. In her current state, nothing mattered except expelling the foreign object from her belly as blood began to seep from the quilt and flow to the floor. Heaven did not pity Tao Hong. The wind and snow were even more intense than the day before. By the time Lao Hai walked home, it was already around 7 or 8 at night. As Tao Hong's screams grew weaker, a few brave women went in to hold her down and give her some brown sugar water to replenish her strength. When Lao Hai arrived, everyone started shouting, but they all had the same idea. They urged him to quickly take Tao Hong to the hospital. Covered in snow, Lao Hai ducked into the house, lifted the quilt to take a look, then covered it again, and came out to squat in the corner, lighting a cigarette. This bald, short man held Tao Hong's life in his hands. Finally, he spoke. "Rong auntie, you have experience. See if she can give birth." The Rong auntie Lao Hai mentioned was my grandmother. She had spent the first half of her life bearing 9 children. With the help of her cane, Grandma walked over. As she entered the door, she sighed lightly, a sound that drifted into everyone's ears and brought a solemn atmosphere. Not only Grandma, but everyone had little hope for Tao Hong's successful childbirth, and Lao Hai seemed to feel the same. Lao Hai stood up, went inside, and took an incense stick. Facing away from the wind and snow, he tilted his head and lit the incense with his cigarette. He was unwilling to spend money on this woman he had picked up, yet he put on a facade of sincere affection and anticipation for the unborn child, hoping heaven would pity their unfortunate family. But heaven did not. From inside came Grandma's verdict. The baby is breech, with one leg extended. It can't be born naturally. As night deepened, Tao Hong's life was slowly slipping away. Lao Hai went inside, gently touched Tao Hong's belly, took a deep drag from his cigarette, exhaled a long plume of smoke, then turned and pulled out a dusty mat from under the bed, spreading it on the ground. The worry in his smoke-shrouded eyes faded, leaving only indifference. He said, "Wrong, auntie. Feel again. See if it's a boy or a girl." Grandma bent over, reached between Tao Hong's legs, and Tao Hong's moaning, which had calmed, suddenly surged again, like the screeching of tires in a sudden stop. "A boy." Sigh. Lao Hai stared at Tao Hong's belly for a long time, the red glow of his cigarette casting a long shadow. Hearing the result, the onlookers outside began to disperse quietly. They already knew Lao Hai's woman was in labor. It was a boy, but it couldn't be born. That was enough. What happened next no longer mattered. Mother also pulled me away, ready to leave. Through the falling snow, I saw Fifth Aunt across the street. Fifth Aunt, wearing a bright red down jacket, sat in a bamboo chair at the door, looking towards the village entrance, waiting for her husband to come home. I didn't know how long she had been waiting, but her eyes were as pale and weak as the winter moon. Tao Hong could no longer struggle. Her cries turned to sobs, growing quieter. At this moment, Fifth Aunt turned her head, looked past the crowd, and towards Lao Hai's small house. Suddenly, she stood up, steadied herself, and went into the kitchen. Shortly after, she came out with a bottle of liquor in her arms, dragging her injured right leg, limping firmly towards Lao Hai's house. I broke free from Mother's hand and followed, seeing Lao Hai about to move Tao Hong onto the mat. He had given up on both Tao Hong and the baby, planning to wrap her in the mat and bury her once she passed away. But Fifth Aunt's arrival made Lao Hai instinctively resist. He pointed at her. "You still have the nerve to come. My son died because of you." Fifth Aunt glanced at Tao Hong and said, "You're planning to bury them anyway. Let me try." Lao Hai's tone softened. "Why should I let you try? I want to leave my son a whole body. Maybe I can save them." This struck a chord with Lao Hai. He didn't stop her, added some firewood to the stove, and went out. I was also chased outside and could only watch through the window. I saw Fifth Aunt sterilize her hands with the liquor, soaking the scissors in it as well. Then she lifted the quilt, roughly shoved the baby's leg back into Tao Hong's body. At this point, Tao Hong was no longer making any noise. Through Tao Hong's belly, Fifth Aunt felt the baby's position and forcefully turned it around. I watched as her entire forearm disappeared inside, and then she pulled out a baby, blue and purple all over. Fifth Aunt cut the umbilical cord, severing the connection between the baby and Tao Hong. She laid the baby on her arm, patting and rubbing it with infinite tenderness and envy in her eyes. I was amazed at Fifth Aunt's ability. Later, Grandma told me that Fifth Aunt had raised sheep in her natal home, and her experience with delivering lambs must have been where she honed her skills. With a loud cry, Lao Hai rushed in, snatching the baby into his arms, fearing that Fifth Aunt might still harm the child she had just saved. Fifth Aunt remained in the posture of holding the baby, her eyes following the baby as it moved away. Some onlookers who hadn't yet left gazed at the baby with various emotions. Be it surprise or pity, not a single gaze was directed at Tao Hong. Tao Hong's once pregnant belly deflated, like discarded packaging. She should have passed away peacefully. That would have been her best end. But fate played a cruel joke, leaving Tao Hong to live stubbornly, as if determined to squeeze out her last bit of value. A year later, Lao Hai was carried back home, lying on a stretcher. There had been an accident at the construction site, and Lao Hai's left leg was amputated, leaving Tao Hong without her only support. After the amputation, Lao Hai's temper became strange, snapping at everyone as if they were responsible for his loss. Tao Hong became his primary target for venting his anger. Every morning, the village woke up to Tao Hong's screams. Her body was always covered in purplish-red bruises, and her scars, pink and worm-like, peeked out from her collar. Her once pink opera costume was stained with dark, dried blood that couldn't be washed away. This continued until early summer, when Tao Hong stopped being beaten and different men began frequenting Lao Hai's house daily. During that period, Lao Hai had no income and lost a leg. Frustrated, he followed fifth uncle into the gambling den. Gambling became Lao Hai's only solace. He used the paltry compensation he got for his leg to chase unrealistic dreams of sudden wealth at the gambling table. In the gambling den, no one cared about his missing leg. Money made him a king. Lao Hai became obsessed, throwing every penny he had into gambling, completely ignoring what the next meal would be or what would happen to Tao Hong and his son. He accumulated massive gambling debts, and his other leg was nearly beaten to a pulp. With no money left, Lao Hai groveled like a dog, begging for mercy from his creditors. The boss stepped on his tear-streaked face, squatting down to whisper the solution to his debt. "Don't you have a woman at home?" Lao Hai understood, viewing the person offering debt relief as a savior, and brought them to Tao Hong's bed, the woman who risked her life to give him a son. Afterward, Lao Hai began selling Tao Hong's body to men for 50 yuan a session. Lao Hai only needed to sit with his son in the doorway, basking in the sun, while men brought him money. Tao Hong no longer left the house. Her dirty clothes couldn't arouse the men's desires, and Lao Hai, unwilling to buy her new clothes, simply stripped her naked and tied her to the bed. Tao Hong's fate gave fifth aunt a sense of superiority. At least she was a respectable woman. Though Tao Hong had borne a son, she had now become a prostitute. Fifth aunt started limping around the village more frequently, basking in her perceived superiority, especially in her love for her husband. After meals, she would visit each household, holding her shoemaking supplies, always talking about the prostitute Tao Hong. Fifth aunt no longer waited at the door for her husband or fought with him about gambling. Instead, she brought him late-night snacks at the gambling den. Handing him the food and drink, she would always add, "Come home early." Lao Hai's woman screams all night, it's terrifying. Her words would inevitably draw praise for her virtue and condemnation for Tao Hong's filth from those at the table. Fifth uncle felt proud and became less harsh toward fifth aunt, returning home more frequently. A few months passed, and there were still no signs of fifth aunt becoming pregnant. Fifth uncle, having grown tired of her, returned to frequenting the gambling den. Fifth aunt became more frantic, seeking out crowds wherever they gathered, regardless of the conversation. She would stand there and start rambling about how despicable Tao Hong was and how Lao Hai had no dignity. Initially, people would nod and agree out of politeness. However, soon enough, whenever they saw fifth aunt approaching, they would disperse. Despite fifth aunt's widespread slander, Lao Hai paid no attention. He was entirely focused on making money off Tao Hong. Unsatisfied with just a few men, Lao Hai took Tao Hong to the construction site, selling her services for 30 yuan a session. Customers quickly multiplied. Except for eating and sleeping, Tao Hong's time was entirely consumed by servicing clients. Lao Hai's tattered clothes were replaced by suits, his hair slicked back. He even took out a loan to build a 3-story mansion in the village, complete with an elevator. Lao Hai had become the village's undisputed wealthy man. During the new year, Lao Hai drove Tao Hong back in a car, the first one in the village. Walking alongside fifth uncle, I was on my way to invite him to our house for dumplings, as Grandma had asked. Lao Hai's car approached, its horn blaring like a wild beast. Fifth uncle, startled, dropped to the ground, thinking it was a debt collector. The window rolled down, and Lao Hai's bald head peeked out from the back seat. With a cigarette in hand, he chuckled, "Oh, my bad. Didn't mean to scare you, old Wu. I heard about your troubles. If you need anything, just ask your old buddy." Now, fifth uncle was in the same position Lao Hai had been 3 years ago. He had gambled away his entire fortune and was deeply in debt. I was in middle school by then and had read enough to detect the underlying boast in Lao Hai's tone, though fifth uncle, bowing obsequiously, thanked Lao Hai for his kindness. "It's nothing. You should come and support my business more often. Old friends get a 20% discount," Lao Hai said, holding up 8 fingers. 80. 800. Lao Hai nodded towards Tao Hong sitting beside him. Fifth uncle's hand fumbled in his pocket, a habit from his days of pulling out cigarettes. But now, with no money to buy any, his hand came up empty. He pretended to pat down his pockets, then rubbed his leg and smiled. Of course, of course. Lao Hai waved his hand, signaling the driver to leave. As the car passed by, I glimpsed Tao Hong through the open window. She had permed her hair into waves, her lips painted a bright red. She wore a tight-fitting down jacket, accentuating her ample bosom. Lao Hai had turned her into an expensive-looking gift. That night, fifth uncle and fifth aunt went into Lao Hai's house. At the end of February, fifth aunt became pregnant and insane. She chopped down the pomegranate tree in their yard, tore up the image of the fertility goddess, and threw herself, laughing, into the icy fish pond. She was rescued and carried to Lao Hai's mansion. This I learned later from the elders. That New Year's Eve, fifth uncle traded fifth aunt for Tao Hong. Lao Hai had his way with fifth aunt and subsequently helped pay off part of fifth uncle's debt. Fifth aunt was carrying Lao Hai's child. She had been married to fifth uncle for nearly 10 years, living a life of submission, always feeling that she had failed him by not bearing children. In the end, it wasn't that she couldn't conceive, it was that fifth uncle was infertile. After being pulled from the fish pond, fifth aunt alternated between crying and laughing around the clock. She ran through the village, lifting her shirt to show her pale belly, twisted with scars old and new. Beneath those scars, a child was growing. She laughed, saying, "I can have a baby. Look, I can really have a baby." Fifth uncle had given fifth aunt to Lao Hai to pay off the rest of his debt. Now, Lao Hai had two insane women. He placed Tao Hong and fifth aunt in adjacent rooms, and we often heard fifth aunt's hostile voice, "I can have a baby too." This was followed by Tao Hong's giggling. She only knew how to giggle. When Tao Hong laughed, her eyes would squint, her chin would lift, and she'd reveal 2 rows of white teeth, looking utterly foolish. If she wasn't crying, this laugh would always be on her face. In her simple mind, the threshold for happiness had become very low. Whenever I saw Tao Hong laughing, I couldn't help but think, if she had been this happy upon seeing her college entrance exam scores, would she have lost her mind? That's something we'll never know. The Tao Hong who was once a student was gone. Now, as a woman, she was being exploited by Lao Hai. When I was young, I pitied Tao Hong, but not fifth aunt. Tao Hong's ordeal of childbirth and prostitution was orchestrated by Lao Hai against her will. Fifth aunt, on the other hand, willingly subjected herself to a life of bearing children and being beaten, seeing herself solely as a woman, not as a person. So, I held a certain disdain for fifth aunt. In middle school, I attended a boarding school and could only return home on weekends. The bus took a newly paved road, dropping me off at the southern entrance of the village. To get home, I had to pass by Lao Hai's house. One weekend, as I got off the bus with my backpack, I saw Lao Hai playing with his son under a tree. Tao Hong and fifth aunt were sitting nearby. Tao Hong was the first to see me. She giggled and waved, while fifth aunt sat with her head down, arms wrapped around her belly, seemingly asleep. I approached, and Tao Hong pointed at my backpack, making excited gestures on her own shoulders. "Do you want to wear it?" Tao Hong nodded. I handed her my backpack. She hugged it to her chest, her fingers slowly caressing it. She did this for a long time, until her smile froze, her mouth drooped, and tears streamed down her face. I didn't know why she was crying, but I hoped she had come to her senses, remembered her unfinished dreams, and would escape Lao Hai to return to her world. But Tao Hong did not regain her sanity. She handed the backpack back to me. I took out a lollipop from my bag and gave it to her. Tao Hong accepted it with a smile and pointed at fifth aunt, then looked back at me. She wanted me to give one to fifth aunt too. I had another, but I didn't want to give it to her. I didn't like this woman who had no sense of self. I shook my head, and Tao Hong lowered hers before offering the lollipop to fifth aunt. Fifth aunt woke up in a daze and slapped the lollipop away. "Don't poison my baby." Tao Hong waved her hands and shook her head, picked up the lollipop, and offered it to fifth aunt again, looking at her expectantly. I stepped in to explain, "Fifth aunt, this is my candy. It's not poisoned." Reluctantly, fifth aunt took the candy, and Tao Hong's face immediately lit up with a smile. Before leaving, I secretly gave Tao Hong another candy. This was the beginning of my interaction with Tao Hong, and to this day, I still wonder if what I did was right. If it weren't for me, would Tao Hong have met the same fate? I realized that Tao Hong liked stationery, so I started bringing her pens, erasers, and notebooks when I came home on weekends. The more stationery I brought, the less she smiled. She no longer greeted me with a cheerful smile when I approached. Instead, her face began to show emotions other than just crying and laughing, sorrow. On the day I realized Peach might no longer be simple-minded, I hurriedly got off the bus with a newly bought stationery box, but she wasn't under the big banyan tree. Only Aunt Wu was napping under the tree, holding her belly. Aunt Wu, where's Peach? Where did she go? I shook Aunt Wu awake. Aunt Wu glanced at me and continued dozing. I shouted from downstairs, Peach, Peach. No one answered. My mother pulled me away, saying, Peach seems to be unwell. She suddenly refuses clients, and Liaowu beat her and locked her up. You mustn't go see her again. Why did she refuse clients? Was she awake? How was her injury? I worried about Peach. In the middle of the night, I woke up my cousin and sneaked over the wall to Liaowu's house. I remembered Peach lived in the room on the east side, and Aunt Wu in the one on the west. The east side was lit, but the west side was dark. My cousin lifted me up by holding onto my legs, and I barely managed to grasp the window ledge and peek inside. To my surprise, Aunt Wu and Peach were sitting on the same bed. Peach wasn't wearing clothes. A metal chain was around her neck, and fresh blood oozed from the deep red whip marks on her body. She didn't cry, her eyes vacant. Aunt Wu applied ointment to Peach's back, cursing, after sleeping with men for so many years. What are you pretending for now? Peach suddenly shed tears, turned around, and hugged Aunt Wu, silently crying on her shoulder. Aunt Wu stopped cursing, her hand resting on the wounds on Peach's back, tears streaming down her own body covered with whip marks from men. I placed the stationery box on the windowsill, tapped the window gently twice, and then ran away with my cousin. The next day, when I went back, the stationery box on the windowsill was gone. I thought Peach must have regained her senses. The old Peach had come back to life, but when I saw her again, she was still smiling foolishly. In the following spring, Aunt Wu, who had waited eagerly for 8 or 9 years, saw her baby grow to 6 months chubby, with arms like lotus roots. However, Aunt Wu herself had shriveled up, looking as if she had aged 10 years in an instant. During the Qingming festival break, I got off the bus as usual with my school bag, and under the cover of willow branches, I saw Peach and Aunt Wu under the banyan tree. Peach had a notebook spread on her lap, writing seriously, with a stationery box beside her feet. Aunt Wu held the baby, breastfeeding, and softly singing a nursery rhyme. The wind rustled the willow branches, and Peach spotted me, smiling foolishly. That night, after a spring rain had fallen all night, it knocked down the blossoms covering the ground. Peach and Aunt Wu, Guiying, were found dead in the peach orchard, covered in peach blossoms. Peach held a stationery box in her hand, the second time she had killed herself. Guiying held her son's toy drum, ending her life because of this. Liaowu hurried over, throwing himself onto Peach, crying bitterly, crying so hard he almost stopped breathing. He wasn't crying for Peach, he was crying for himself. I didn't dare to approach. Peach could have lived in ignorance, but because of me, she died awake. Liaohui's house was mortgaged, and fifth uncle went to another place to drive a truck. In the following years, I never saw them again. The stories of Peach and Liaohui, Guiying, and fifth uncle gradually faded from people's memories. Later, I went to high school. On the first day of school, during the class meeting, the head teacher gave each of us a letter. She said, "These are time capsules written by former top students with their real names, encouraging you with their past achievements." The envelope in my hand was pale pink, decorated with a few bows, and the name of the senior sister was Zhang Miao. I tore open the envelope, feeling numb in my mind, hearing a foolish laugh in my ears. The paper was attached with a student ID photo, in a blue and white school uniform, with a high ponytail and a naive smile. It was Peach. I didn't listen to what the teacher said during the entire class meeting. I read Zhang Miao's letter over and over again. "Hello, I'm your senior sister Zhang Miao. This time, I miraculously got first place in the school mock exam. The teacher asked me to write my thoughts and encourage you younger students, but I'm really nervous. Because I don't love studying, I only love myself. It wasn't until I got into high school that I realized I was a slave raised by my parents for my younger brother. They expected me to go to a good school, make money, and pave the way for my brother's smooth life. Of course, I didn't want to. But my father would marry me off to someone I didn't know, according to my mother. He was an old rich man. By then, I really had nothing. I'd rather be a slave to my brother. I only had one chance. I had to get into the best university so that I could have the power to choose. I'm not a good student. I study hard to live a life that others are born with. There's nothing I can encourage you with, but I have a blessing. I hope you can live for yourself. I closed the envelope, and the memory of silly Muyao gradually overlapped with the naive Muyao in the photo. Muyao killed Peach to keep herself alive forever in her memory. Muyao, you really lived once for yourself.